Great stuff. Okay, so part two. And I was doing some more research over the week, and made me think, when you look at a topic like the early church, and you start with the Bible as your base plate, and then you move out into what they call secular history written by men and women, and data gathered in the normal way, but it hasn't got the certainty of the Bible, but it's often linked back to the Bible. And it reminded me of in New Zealand, we do a lot of what they call tramping. Tramping is just bushwalking, walking on the hills and the mountains and walking through the bush. And when you come to a flooded stream, sometimes the best thing to do, if you don't know the stream at all, is to have someone on the bank. You tie a rope around your waist and someone on the bank, one or two, and you start to walk across the flooded stream. Really see where you're going. But if you fall, someone can always pull you back. You might have to swim back, but they can pull you back. And it's a bit like what we're engaged in now, is to constantly check and recheck if what we're saying reinforces Bible principles, reflects the Bible story, and rests on the certainty of Scripture. And in the same way, sometimes when we're crossing these mountain streams, and that's where most trampers get killed if they don't die of exposure and things like that, is actually crossing flooded streams, because the floods bring down boulders and snags and things which you can't see. And sometimes there appear to be stepping stones, and the stepping stones, you have to make a full stride in the middle of the flooded stream. You don't know if that stone's going to take your weight or not, or it may. You don't know if someone's been there before you. You don't know if a flood has moved the stone or unsettled it. So the same thing, what we do is we go very carefully. And I was digging around the other day, and of course we looked at Joseph of Arimathea and Aristobulus last week. And we're going to look at another three characters who also appear in the Bible very briefly. But just digging around and reading a book, I came across a reference by a man called Jowett, a scholar called Jowett, who studied what's called the Martyrologies of the Greek Church. Very deep stuff. Must admit I've never read it. But he says about Aristobulus, Aristobulus was one of the 70 disciples and a follower of St. Paul the Apostle, along with whom he preached the gospel to the whole world and ministered to them. He was chosen by St. Paul to be the missionary bishop to the land of Britain. He was there martyred after he had built churches and ordained deacons on the island, etc., etc. And according to Jowett, he was the first martyr in Britain killed at Verulamium, not by the Romans, but by the Britons, who still wanted to hold on to the pagan beliefs. And then again, it says, according to tradition, I know this will get Sandra Allen very excited. He was preparing the way for Paul to visit London and preach on Ludgate Hill, where St. Paul's Cathedral now stands. We don't know, but that's a man, that's evidence of a quote. And you always look for it to be backed up. And then I came across another one. I mentioned him briefly, Dorotheus, Bishop of Tyre, one of the early church fathers, and these guys recorded them. They were first on the block, first, second, third generation Christians. And this guy was writing in 303 AD, Dorotheus, Bishop of Tyre. So they had a little church going in Tyre. He says, Aristobulus, who is mentioned by the apostle in his epistles to the Romans, was made bishop in Britain. And he also states that the disciple Simon Zelotes, who's also mentioned in the Bible, Simon the Zealot. One of Jesus' 12 apostles was killed in Britain soon after arriving in AD 60 during the revolt of Boudicca, Queen Boudicca. And he was the second martyr in Britain put to death at Caister by crucifixion on orders of the Roman imperial agent Catus Decianus. And we know Catus Decianus, he was a bit of a villain. He actually started the whole Boudicca revolt himself. So what we've got is this exciting time when we move on to these next three characters. Not only is the church launching itself into this amazing time, it's from the time of the first generation of Christians. They sometimes call it the age of the apostles. Those are the guys who walked and talked with Jesus. They knew him as their friend and as the Messiah and as the risen one, and they saw him risen from the dead. And as John said, we could even touch him and talk to him. So these were the first generation Christians. And then also within that first generation, you get Christians who could speak to Peter, who could speak to James, who could speak to Paul and Simon Zelotes, who could speak to Joseph of Arimathea and Aristobulus. So imagine the excitement on that and hear the stories. But on top of that, we're in a generation, and this should ring a bell with us too, that the signs and wonders they heard done by Jesus and the signs and wonders they heard done by the apostles, miracles and the healings, they themselves were doing it. And they themselves knew people. They had testimonies like us. They had testimonies. It was an exciting time. And these were committed people. And boy, they had to be committed because they were living, I guess as we are now, in a world that's inherently hostile to the gospel. Most of the apostles, or I think nearly all of them, with the exception of John, were actually martyred for preaching the gospel. I mean, they tried to kill John, but they couldn't do it. Dangerous time, super dangerous. Christianity started being very upfront and very on the surface in Jerusalem, and thousands of people being baptized and saved, filled with the Spirit. And then there was a massive counterattack, even led by guys like Paul, Saul at that time. And the church was scattered and reeled. And then the signs and wonders kept going. Paul was galvanized as another recruit. And the church leapt into life again. And already men like Joseph of Arimathea and Aristobulus had gone out. Gone out? Why had they gone out? They'd gone out because the Lord told them, like in Matthew 28, go out there, like in Mark 16, get out there. Like Jesus said to Peter, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. So they were absolutely convinced that putting themselves in harm's way was not something they did deliberately, but it was a feature of being a Christian. And it took immense courage, but also on top of that, it took the passion of knowing, the assurance. You know, it wasn't like, oh, this is some vague legend or story you've heard from hundreds of years ago, and you really like it, and it's colorful and it's exciting and it sounds like really could be great if it was true. For these people, as it is for us today, it's real, double-dyed real. You know, within every fellowship around the world, there are miracles like these folks were experiencing in the first century AD. And that's part of, I guess, this series, is to let us make the connection between where we are now. You know, we mustn't be, I suppose to a certain extent we can be overawed by these folks. They were wonderful saints. but we mustn't separate ourselves from them. They're ordinary men and women, ordinary folks, caught up by being born again, caught up by finding themselves in a world that is now completely different and yet the same. Now, surrounding them, the Roman Empire itself was going through a turbulent time. You know, you had Augustus way back when Jesus was first born, the first of the Roman emperors, giving himself the title of the Glorious One. It was interesting that Jesus, who was the Glorious One, was actually born during his reign. And interesting, the titles that the Roman emperors gave themselves, actually pretty much the titles that you would give to the Lord, you know, ruler of heaven and earth and the Glorious One. And they made themselves divine or sons of God. I think Augustus called himself a son of God. But that was all for political purposes. They didn't actually believe it. It just suited them. It's a wonderful irony that the Son of God did come. The Glorious One did come. The one to rule the heavens and the earth, ruling the heavens and the earth, had come among them. But we find, for example, when Paul is very active, there's the Emperor Claudius, and then of course he's executed by the Emperor Nero, and then we find a period of, if you like, civil war and disturbance, and 3 emperors very quickly, and then Vespasian and Titus, and then the era of Domitian, and subsequently Marcus Aurelius, and a number of them persecuted Christians actively. You think, well, why are they bothering to take the time? You know, they're trying to rule an empire, the huge Pax Romana, the Roman peace, stretching its biggest empire the world had seen up to this date. And they're taking time out to persecute this Christian sect. And at first they associated the Christian sect, like Claudius did, with the Jews. They just said it's another Jewish sect. And when Claudius hurled or tried to hurl all the Christians out of Rome, he said the Jews and the Christians. He lumped them together. And Nero, looking for a scapegoat after Rome burnt to the ground, Christians, they're a good target, gets after them. And then later on, Domitian. We're not saying every emperor, and we're not saying it was non-stop, but to be a Christian could be a very dangerous and short career. And yet, what do we find? We find there's no shortage of Christians. There's no shortage of people taking up the gospel and running with it. And it's almost like at the end of Acts chapter 28, and we go into the early church history, which is outside the Bible, and it seems to me to be seamless. What we find is the book of Acts has not stopped. There are new personalities coming in. There are people who have a very small profile in the actual Bible and now have quite a large profile. But the gospel hasn't stopped. It is running like a train. It's not going to keep doing that. It's going to hit some trouble. But we're going to turn now to 3 people who really reflect that huge revival fellowship that was spreading across the Roman world during the first and second generation of the apostles after the resurrection of Christ. And if we go to 2 Timothy, go to 2 Timothy, and we go to the last chapter of 2 Timothy, chapter 4, where Paul is actually coming to the end of his career, really, as an apostle. He's not stopping being a saint and loyal to the Lord and preaching the gospel, but he's in prison in Rome. He's awaiting execution. He's been on borrowed time for a while, and he hasn't wasted that time. But he points out that a lot of his work that he did in Asia has fallen to bits. A lot of people that were with him are now gone. But there are some still left. And he's writing from Rome. Of course, he's in prison. And he starts sending greetings at the end of chapter 4, 2 Timothy. And he says in verse 19, salute Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus abode at Corinth, but Trophimus have I left at Miletum sick. Do thy diligence to come before winter. Eubulus greeteth thee, and Pudens, and Linus, and Claudia, and all the brethren. The Lord Jesus Christ be with thy spirit. Grace be with you. Amen. We're going to look at Pudens, Linus, and Claudia as real people, because they are, as real saints, because they are, as workers for the Lord, because all the indications were that that's exactly what they did. And it's interesting that Paul takes time to make special mention, but doesn't actually say what they were doing. Now, I might be wrong, but I believe that it's almost like the Lord saying, what can you find? You know, in Proverbs 25, verse 2, it says, it is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. We are kings, kings and priests. What can we find out about Claudia and Linus and Pudens? Well, I reckon they should make a movie of this one. Claudia, that wasn't her actual name. Well, it was really, but it was a name given to her. We're pretty sure. I can give you the references later. It was a name given to her by the Emperor Claudius. So that makes her a big hitter. If you were given a name by the Emperor Claudius, it meant that you'd been adopted into the imperial household. And at that stage in Rome, during the era of the Claudian dynasty, remember Claudius, he declared himself to be semi-divine or divine or something. You could not use the name Claudia unless you were part of the imperial household. Okay, if you did, you'd probably be executed, or your parents would be. So she's got a name given to her by the Emperor Claudius, and we managed to do some detective work and find out why. So she's really interesting. The guy, by the way, just interesting, isn't it? Her original name, Gladys. Can you imagine that? No wonder she changed the name. Oh, sorry if there are people here called Gladys, but like Gladys Bovis, who I love dearly. But Gladys is seen as a bit of a Victorian name, isn't it? It's actually very ancient. Ah, now we're getting a clue. Gladys is a Celtic name. It's a Briton name. It was unknown to the Romans. So that's reason A why Claudius, who had adopted her into the household, had given her a Roman name, Claudia. Now, who is Pudens? Well, you could say, well, how do we know who Pudens is? It's just one mention. How are we expected to know who this guy Pudens is? Got one. Well, again, I can give you the references later. We find out, whereas, you know, within history, in history, what we're doing all the time is trying to narrow the gap of uncertainty. It's exactly the same as science. Scientists actually cannot be 100% sure about many things, but they talk about narrowing the gap of uncertainty. It's a really good principle. That's what we do in history. And we can get the principle of uncertainty really narrowed down with Claudia and Pudens. Pudens was a man called Aulus Pudens. He was a soldier. He was a Roman soldier. Claudia, alias Gladys, was a Briton. Aulus Pudens is a Roman soldier. And we know at the time, we're able to get another little picture, and I'll tell you later how. He's a young soldier, and Claudia is also young when this letter is written. Here's something for you. When you dig around, they're man and wife. Pudens and Claudia were married. It was a controversial marriage, but it was one that had the blessing of the emperor. Wow, now we're getting in deep. So who's Linus? Linus means blonde or flaxen hair. It's an unusual name. It's a Latin name, so he's a Roman citizen like Pudens. Some traditions say that he actually came from Volterra in Italy and he was just an Italian. Now, that's a bit odd if his name means blonde or flaxen hair. There are other sources in history which say, he's a Briton. He's the brother of Claudia. He's Claudia's brother. And they're all mentioned together. Now, Eubulus, we've been able to find virtually zero about Eubulus. It's a Greek name. He's a Gentile by the look of it, and a Christian. As yet, we have found out that's all. But we found out a lot about these other three characters. We think we've really narrowed the gap of uncertainty. So what was going on? Well, what they represented, long story short, was a counter-revival within the church. Now that sounds bad, but it's actually good. This was the spreading of the gospel with guys like Joseph of Arimathea and Aristobulus and Simon Zelotes had gone out to Britain very early on in the AD, mid to late AD 30s, AD 40s, AD 50s. And now these people, we find out, represented the gospel now coming back from Britain to Rome. So people converted in Britain were now coming to Rome to carry on the conversion work. Wow. And then we find something amazing. They didn't stop there. We're now pretty sure, and we can work that out from the letter to the Romans, we're pretty sure that then they returned to Britain as soon as they could to carry on the gospel. And they weren't there forever, like Aristobulus dying in Britain. They made a real success of what they were doing, and then they seem to have been invited back to Rome to run a safe house in Rome, because things were getting hot under emperors like Nero and under emperors like Domitian, who was a real piece of work in his way, who deliberately went after the Christians. And they were running a safe house to get Christians out of Rome. And they were using their imperial influence, because they were members of the imperial household, to smuggle Christians out of Rome. They're running what the American Civil War, they called it an underground railway. Like in the Second World War, you had the resistance smuggling pilots back to Britain or the safety of allied countries. That's what they were running. You know, to work that out too. How come? Because you dig and you dig and you dig and you find a story, and then you think, is this a stepping stone, which is just all on its own? It's going to flip me into the water and I'm going to look a fool. I need some other evidence to back it up. And then you find more evidence and more evidence, the stepping stone becomes secure, and then you go to the next stepping stone. Maybe that will try and flip you up. But you've got a rope around your waist attaching you back to the Bible. So you can always press on, next stepping stone. Okay, what happened? What do we think happened? I can, provide references and things like this afterwards. This is what we think happened. We know that the Emperor Claudius decided to invade Britain. seemed to be a good idea. In the AD 40s, he decided to invade Britain. Why? Well, he was looking for a bit of propaganda to support him as a great and mighty emperor. Because if you couldn't persuade the mob back in Rome that you were a successful emperor, you won battles, you won victories, soon enough you'd be attracting the assassins. Soon enough you'd be attracting the plots. Some emperors were even assassinated by their own bodyguards because they weren't effective as emperors. Now he knew, he had watched a lot of his family get killed in these conspiracies and assassinations. And, the great Robert Graves series called I, Claudius, which they turned into a series of BBC films, is about this dangerous world that the imperial dynasties lived in. He needed to advance his CV. Looked around for a place to invade. Oh, I know what, we'll invade Britain. We haven't invaded that yet. Now, on the surface, that was not a very wise thing to do because Britain was already very peaceful. It traded a lot with Rome. There were a lot of contacts between merchants, as we heard with Joseph of Arimathea. It was a place that was seen as a good trading friend or partner with Rome. Why disturb it? Well, because you want to get your name and glory on some pillar in Rome. You want a statue raised in your honor. You want the Senate to tell you what a great conqueror you are. So he set off for Britain with an army, and Aulus Pudens went with him. And we've been able to find out that Aulus Pudens was a direct relative, if not a nephew or a son, of Aulus Plautius, who is Claudius's chief commander. And he also took another young general called Vespasian, who would later become an emperor. Vespasian would make his reputation in Britain with his military campaign in the west around Bath, in Somerset and in Dorset. So Aulus Pudens, he was of a noble family, and when you became when you were of a noble family, you were expected to do 3 years military service in the Roman army. Your duty to Rome. And sometimes the young sons of senators did their duty on a very quiet provincial outpost and nothing ever happened. Aulus Pudens found himself sent to Britain to take on the Britons. Now Claudius went mob-handed because he knew that the Britons were going to take exception to this. Imagine, could you understand? Imagine if it is suddenly Italy decided to invade England because it needed to win the next general election in Italy. And the Italian Prime Minister declared war on Britain, a trading partner. Can you imagine how the British would receive an armed invasion? Well, the Britons did exactly the same thing when Claudius arrived with his legions. They fought like cats and dogs. And to the Roman surprise, I mean, they should have read their Julius Caesar because Julius Caesar would have told them, they fought extremely well and they fought highly organized. But the worst thing Claudius could do is turn back and defeat. That'd be a death sentence for him. So he said to Aulus Claudius, you've got to win, mate. And even during the fighting, Claudius went back to Rome to even get more equipment, more help, more elephants, etc. They fought 2 huge battles, the Battle of the Medway near Rochester and Gillingham. And it was touch and go because they'd bumped into a tribe called the Catapolauni, led by a man called Caractacus, who had a son and a daughter called Linus and Gladys. That's the 2 we're looking at now. Gladys was a princess. She was the daughter of a king. Linus was a prince. He was the son of Caractacus. He could well have been king, as it was a guy who rejoiced in the name Cogidubnus. He became king later on, but don't worry about young Cogidubnus. So the Battle of the Medway, and the Romans were reeling, and right in the middle of it is Aulus Pudens. He could have been killed at any time. The young tribunes, the young junior officers in their military service were expected to serve in the front line in the hottest fire. That was the Roman principle. They called them the Uenes, the young men. And the Uenes always fought in the front line, and that's where the casualty rates were highest. Behind them was always a line of veterans, supporting them, encouraging them, looking after them. Our friend in 2 Timothy, he would have been blooded as a warrior very early on in his career. He survives the Battle of Medway, we know that. Then we know he goes on to the next great battle, the Battle of the Thames. They crossed the Medway, they fought their way across. Aulus Claudius said, no, we've got to keep going. We cannot stop now. If we stop now, they will reorganize and sweep us into the sea. They pushed on and they arrived at London near Lambeth, and they fought at the Thames. And Claudius was a really good soldier, and Aulus Pudens would have been there again, fighting in the front line probably. Lost quite a few of his mates maybe, perhaps he'd been wounded, we don't know. But they waded across the Thames at low tide. And the Britons had even stuck stakes under the water, and they've recovered some of these stakes from an earlier crossing at Richmond. Because you know how the Thames does this all the time? It twists and turns. The Romans had to cross the Thames in their invasions 2 or 3 times. They couldn't believe it. But the Britons anchored sharpened stakes under the water. And that we're told that a lot of Roman soldiers were killed on them, horses were impaled by them, but they waded the Thames and they fought their way up the muddy bank. And at last the Britons broke and scattered. And the Romans thought, right, we've got to break. And Aulus Claudius said, no, we haven't got to break, we've got to push on. It began a series of campaigns that went from AD 40 to AD 60. It included Boudicca's revolt, and it raged across Britain. And in the middle of it was Aulus Pudens. But here's where the Bible comes in, so the story can be told. Caractacus, fighting, he retreats to the Welsh borders where he's fighting. He finally gets defeated and captured, along with his family, Linus and Gladys, and his queen. Now, normally, in the fury of so many Roman soldiers being killed, that was a death sentence for all of them. They wipe out the royal family. And there was a loyal tribe, loyal to the Romans, called the Atrovartis. And the Atrovartis would have been given control of the kingdom. The Atrovartis remained loyal to the Romans throughout the occupation. So that would have been the normal knee-jerk reaction for Claudius. Kill the royal family, wipe them out. But they were so impressed by Caractacus that they decided to do it in a 2-step. We'll send the royal family back to Rome. Linus, Gladys, and Caractacus. We'll put Caractacus on a show trial, and then we will either crucify him or burn him or kill him in the arena, but we'll make sure we get the maximum out of it. You know, this is the mighty man who we've managed to bring down to conquer Britain. And it wasn't quite sure what was going to happen to Claudia, Gladys, and Linus, but they went anyway. And it's a bit vague as to what happened to Caractacus' wife, who was also called Gladys. There you go, seems to have been a popular name. She may well have come with them. We're not sure. Did she die? Was she killed in the fighting? But they get sent back to Rome. And don't think it stops in Britain. in Britain, the fighting's still going to rage for another 10, 20 years. Sometimes with little patches of peace. If you all know about the story of Boudicca when she rises up with the Iceni, and Colchester's burnt to the ground, London's burnt to the ground, St Albans is burnt to the ground before the Romans stop it. This is edge of your seat stuff. Great movie time. Aulus Pudens seems to have been put in charge of the royal family, the tribune, because they're kind of like under open arrest. Make sure they get back to Rome. He falls in love with Gladys. She must have been quite a girl. And if you're a Hollywood movie producer, you think, oh, this is corker. This young, battle-hardened tribune in the Roman army of a pagan background falls in love with Gladys. And his job is to look after her and Linus and Caractacus and perhaps the queen. And he impresses them with his nobility and his sense of dignity and his fairness. And wait for it, guys. They let him into a secret. They're Christians. Wow. There are not many of those among the Britons. The Romans had heard of this Christian stuff. Of course, Claudius had. They thought it was way back in Palestine and way back in Greece and way back in Rome. Aulus is told, we think, by Gladys, later Claudia, shall I keep calling her Claudia, that they're Christians. And he's really taken by their dignity, and they don't show any sort of desire for vengeance or anger. And they're taken by him. And Gladys witnesses to him. Gladys Claudia witnesses to him. And we're pretty sure from the records we've got, and this guy, Kenneth Harper Finton, another guy called Ambrose Mooney, and one or two other historians who've really looked into this, say it looks like they were baptized by Aristobulus. That's the evidence that they've got. It's a pretty good guess. It's a guess that moves from possible to probable, that they became Christians because of Aristobulus. Like we see in those other references, he was preparing the way for Paul, so it was said. He moved into the Midlands. He was working among the Catavilani. He was working among the tribes, and he converted the royal family to Christianity. Some people say it might have been Joseph of Arimathea. Well, yeah, it could have been too. He, as we're pretty sure too, had what they call a Vetusta Ecclesiae, an established church at Glastonbury. And some people say Glastonbury could be where it is now, but there's also a strong argument that Glastonbury was near a place called Lichfield or in the Midlands, but it doesn't matter. Pudens, this young Roman tribune, suddenly finds himself looking after some very special people. He gets them back to Rome, while a good part of the legions stay in Britain still fighting. Vespasian, for example, that was going to make his career take off. But Aulus Pudens escorts them back to Rome, and the big show trial begins. Now, can you imagine what he's thinking? He's fallen in love with the princess. He's now actually got in charge of their sort of maybe their house arrest or working in that area. And he's thinking, I'm helping to kill them. He's really impressed. And some people say he was converted to being a Christian in Britain. And there's certainly evidence for that. Did he do it secretly? Did he do it openly? Well, one thing that maybe he did it openly was that we do know that the general, remember the general, Aulus Claudius, who was the uncle, I think, of Pudens, his wife, she converted to Christianity. And boy, did that cause a scandal. She's what they call a Roman matron. She's one of the senior Roman nobility. She's the wife of Rome's top general. She should be worshipping the emperor. And they knew a thing or two about these Christians, that they refused to worship the emperor. They refused to burn incense to any other gods. They refused to acknowledge any other gods or temples, only their God and Jesus, Christus, as the Romans called him. And now the wife of the senior general has come out and said she's a Christian, converted in Britain. That's quite an outreach that the first wave have got going. Joseph of Arimathea, Aristobulus, Simon Zelotes, maybe Paul, we don't know. But Claudius, back in Rome, he can feel the political tremblings beneath his feet now. Excuse me. What's he got going here? He's told people he's got a successful campaign going in Britain. It isn't over yet. He's brought back Caractacus, the great mighty war leader. And now there's embarrassment setting in because he hears that his commander-in-chief's wife is now converted, and maybe this tribune's converted. And, these Christians that Claudius had or was about to order out of Rome for being a pain in the neck, what is he going to do with them? Well, okay, he needs an excuse for a quick death. He puts Caractacus on trial. And in those days, a political trial, you went to the Senate, which is like the upper house, what we call the upper House of Lords now. The Senate House, if a person was of note, they'd be put on trial in the Senate. Caractacus is condemned to death. Big show trial, mob waiting to see how they're going to kill this guy. Are they going to kill his family as well? Might be good. Add to the show. And as is always, a condemned man is asked if he wants to say something in his defense. And Caractacus, and we got this confirmed by, the Romans at the time, he says he would just like to say something. He gives a speech. We haven't got the speech word for word, but we've got the summary of it, or what we call the paraphrase. He gives a speech which is so full of power, so full of dignity, so lacking in anger, so, as one historian said, so civilized and so to the point that almost without exception, the Senate at the end of the speech say, we cannot condemn this man. We're not going to execute him. We don't care what the mob want outside. We don't care what the emperor wants. We cannot condemn this man. I guess part of the advantage of the wonderful timing of history is that Claudius was actually, he had a lot of failings to Claudius, but he was a scholar. He loved education. He loved culture. He loved libraries. Before he became an emperor, that was his retreat to escape from all the family conspiracies and stuff going on. He would retreat to the library and read. He loved the civilization of Rome. He wasn't a soldier, really. When he heard what Caractacus had said, he said, neither can I condemn him. Caractacus was set free almost. It was unique. They just didn't do that, the Romans. But he was set free, and his family too, but placed under house arrest in the house of the Roman emperor under the imperial protection. It's a controversial move. And Claudius shows a bit of backbone. He protects them. And at the end of the Philippians, the letter, right at the end of Philippians, we've got another little possible clue when Paul's writing to the Philippians. in chapter 4, verse 22, he's signing off and he says, all the saints salute you, chiefly they that are of Caesar's household. Caesar's household. Those who lived under protection of Caesar. Some people say, oh, that just means the servants. Well, it might do. Other historians say that's possibly an indicator of Caractacus, Claudia, Pudens, and Linus. Possibly. Nice little aside. But we do know, we're as sure as we can be, that they were now under the protection of the emperor. Gladys's name was changed to Claudia. In that honor, don't touch her. A warning to all the plotting politicians and the sort of gossip columns of ancient Rome. Leave her alone. Linus, we're not even sure that that was the original name, but he now takes a Latin name, which means blonde-haired or flaxen-haired. And Pudens, guess what? He goes ahead and he marries Claudia. And I understand from my research that the only reason he was able to do that was that he had the protection of Caesar, because that is an off-the-wall thing to do. She's a rebel, set free. Her father killed a lot of Roman soldiers in action. He's set free. Her brother is an heir to a rebel throne. He's been set free. And you, as a young tribune, a rising star in the Roman nobility, you're going to marry that girl? Married her. Almost certainly now he's a Christian. Almost certainly, probably, because Claudia would have rejected him if he wasn't. You know, she wasn't going to be unequally yoked. She's a remarkable young lady. Gosh, got to get off soon. Does it stop there? Oh, it's a great story. It's a great story. We can tell by AD 55, when the letter of Romans is letter to the Romans is written by Paul from Corinth. He doesn't mention them. And he just says of Aristobulus, those of Aristobulus' household he greets. Okay, why? Aristobulus, we're almost certain, is back in Britain. Why doesn't he mention Claudia and company? Well, they're back in Britain. How does that work? Come on, guys, we're stretching it. Well, the campaign, the fighting in Britain is going on, still going on. The Romans are desperate to win. Aulus Pudens probably got posted back to his legion, which probably was posted back to Britain. And Claudia almost certainly went with him. It was an opportunity. And Linus seems to have gone as well, her brother. They didn't go to fight. Poor old Aulus Pudens would certainly have had to. But they went to spread the gospel, from what we can work out. Next thing, cutting to the chase, they're back in Rome. As I said, they're back in Rome, and we're finding that they're running a safe house in Rome. Things have really heated up. The Emperor Claudius is now going tooth and claw after the Christians in Rome. He leaves Caractacus's family out of it. And do you know what the deal would have been? I'm guessing, guys, but you can throw rocks at me later. He probably left them out of it on the basis they didn't get involved. You know, don't force me to execute you. Don't force me to throw you to the mob. They went undercover and they didn't worship the emperor. They worshiped God. They followed the gospel. It seems from what we can work out that they went undercover and they ran a safe house. Now, in Rome, there's still a house in Rome called, its original name was the Palatium Britannicum, which means the Palace of Britain, or the Palace of the Britons, or the Palace of Britannia. It was later named the Hospitium Apostolorum, the sheltering house of the apostles, or safe house for apostles. Today, and I'm only reading from the guidebooks, so I haven't been to this place in Rome, although I have been to Rome. Today it is called Saint Pudentiana, which is the name of one of Claudia and Puden's daughters. We know that in history. Pudentiana was one of Claudia and Puden's daughters living in Rome. And we know something about her from her sister Praxedes. Praxedes kept a diary, first century diary, and she records the death of her sister. Pudentiana was put to death during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 AD, for refusing to acknowledge the Emperor Marcus Aurelius as divine and worthy of worship as a god. Pudentiana was only 16 years old at the time. That's the dangerous game. So that Pudens and Claudia had brought their children up as Christians, and at least one of them died as a Christian, professing the faith. And her name has endured even to this day. And one historian made a little aside, which I thought was quite charming, actually. He said, not far from the house now called the House of Pudentiana is the great Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome. But this historian said, St. Peter's in Rome is not the true Roman church. If you want a site of the true Roman church, it's the House of Pudentiana. That's where the true gospel was preached. I thought, wow. The guy who wrote that wasn't a fellowship guy, just a historian. See the impact of these early Christians. See the example they set. And the debate still rages about Claudia, especially the historians zero in on Claudia. How could this possibly be that this one mentioned girl, you can draw all this stuff out? Well, the guy who's done most of the work for me is an American historian called Harper Fenton, but I've read other references too, which back him up and saying it is her, it's her all right, as sure as we can be. And just as a footnote to finish off, oh, Anthony, you're going to kill me, mate. Just as a footnote to finish off, remember I told you that Aulus Pudens, he was a nobleman and a tribune in the Roman army and a rising star, if you like, born to lead, all this sort of stuff. He had a mate, he had a friend that he'd grown up with before he became a Christian in Rome. We know him by his name, his second name, Martialis. He was a poet. He was more than a poet, Martial. When he and Pudens were sort of young lads knocking about Rome, he was a jet setter, was Martial. He was a playboy, but he could write poetry. And we've still got a lot of Martial's poems, which are very famous and they're studied in literature. A lot of them are what we would class as junk. They're very bad taste poems. They're poems written for the mob, written to sell. They're beautifully written. He's obviously a very good poet. But we would never have any dealings with the bad taste poetry he writes, but the world thinks it's fantastic. Except for one poem. He writes one poem in honor of Aulus's wife. Remember, Aulus is his good mate, but Aulus probably doesn't have much to do with him now because Aulus has become a Christian. probably a bit of a puzzle to Marshall. But as a kind of a sign of affection, Marshall writes a poem for Claudia, which has become famous because it's the one poem that Marshall wrote, which is clean and which is in good taste. And he calls Claudia, I better get her title right, otherwise I'll be in trouble. He calls Claudia Rufina of the Painted Britons. Claudia Rufina, the Peregrina. The Peregrina means the woman from foreign lands. And he writes so tenderly of her and with such respect. And he writes that her beauty, her physical beauty, is equally matched by her spiritual beauty. And that surely there is no one among the women of Rome like Claudia of the Painted Britons, wife of Aulus Pudens, whose physical beauty is matched by her spiritual beauty. Wow, how's that for a testimony? And everyone in Rome would have known she's a Christian and Aulus is a Christian. So even though Claudia has long since died, and Linus became the first bishop of Rome after Peter. You know, I know there's the thing, was Peter bishop in Rome, but there's a very strong that that when Peter died, Linus took over and he did become bishop of Rome. And we're pretty sure, I think we got a letter from Linus writing as bishop from Rome. But Claudia, her testimony goes on and on through the words of a Roman poet who most of the stuff he wrote was a complete waste of time. But once you know that she's a Christian, then it becomes a ringing testimony of the early church battling against such supreme odds in first century Rome and in the first century Roman Empire. But next week, we move on to where the waters get really choppy for the church. I'll leave it there. Amen.